Hey everyone, we'll get started here in about 3 minutes or so. Okay, everyone, for this session, I'm not sure exactly how long this will last, only because we'll see how far we get with the slides. If possible, it would be nice to have, if we had some discussion, because I want to talk about the article from last week a little bit, and then a little bit into the Little Siegel book. So, and you'll have to forgive me because I'm a little bit out of it this morning because didn't get much sleep last night. So, but we'll go ahead and get started here. And also, I have everybody on mute when you enter, but I believe you can still hit your talk button. So maybe we can have a little bit of discussion, or you can just type in the chat box. In fact, that reminds me, just make sure to have your chat open. Okay, so for this week, you've seen the announcements. So there's an extension on that assignment, the reading assignment, till Wednesday. And just a couple other things. You may have noticed from the announcements that I'm going to give everybody an opportunity for extra credit. It doesn't have to be done anytime soon, but just as, well, it's not, we don't have any articles from your textbook, but one of the textbooks that I used to use in a different place when I was at Valencia is there was a great article on how to be a movie critic. So I want to give everybody the opportunity to do that if you want for a movie called Maria Full of Grace. Now, most of you probably haven't seen it. It was kind of a little known movie from 2004, but I know the actress, Catalina Sandingo Moreno, was nominated for an Oscar, and I think the movie was nominated for Best Picture. But anyways, it's a Spanish movie, but it's a very, very interesting movie. So you can find it on various places. I think YouTube has the whole thing, by the way, but there are other places you can get it. So also just a couple other announcements too. As I mentioned later on this semester, when we get to around Thanksgiving, you could have kind of the same assignment, only viewing a movie called Pieces of April, which once again was a little known movie. Most people never even heard of it, but in my opinion, it's one of the best movies about Thanksgiving. Also, as I mentioned in the announcements as well, later this semester, in fact, I just heard from him last night, actually, one of my professors at UCF, who is in the film department there, um, maybe this semester later on, he said that he'd be willing to, we'll show a screening of a movie that he wrote in the 1980s called Crimes of Passion. And his name is Barry Sander, and he's written a lot of Hollywood projects. So I talked to him last night, and he said he'd be willing to do that so we could introduce the movie and have kind of a Q&A session with him afterwards. But he said, and there's no problem with licensing or anything like that, because it would be a case where that's covered under copyright laws if it's for a class. So maybe this semester we could maybe meet at a place like the Regal or the Enzian. But he said that there'd probably be a rental fee that maybe our college could cover. Also, as I mentioned this week, I want to talk a little bit about the article from last week, and then also cover the third bullet point here, which is the little seagull from 90 to 118. Wednesday, we'll look more at the they say, I say. Also, a reminder that this week we have on Sunday, we don't have another like reading or writing assignment except for the timed essay that they make all English classes do, or English 1101 classes do. And so it'll be a situation where I'll give you a topic. In fact, I might give you a few topics that you can choose from. And it's a simple assignment. You would just take like a quote or a topic that I'll give you, and you're just gonna write an essay on it. So it'll be timed, but I think it's gonna be due Sunday. But I think what I'll do is I'll open it up later this week. I mean, first I want you to focus on the reading assignment that's due Wednesday, if you haven't done it already. So remember, there's an extension for that. But it'll simply be where the timed essay, I'll simply give you a quote or a topic, and then you would just write an essay, and I'll have the instructions laid out. And in fact, if we have time later today, I'll show you a video, which is maybe one of the topics that you can choose from. So we'll see if we get to that. But first, let's talk a little bit about the article that you're either writing on by Wednesday or that you have already written about. And just out of curiosity, you can type in the chat box, what did you think of the article, or just the question in general? Should everyone go to college? And it's kind of a interesting topic because in a class like this, you are all in college. So your initial gut reaction might be, of course, everyone should go to college. So I just want to lay out some reasons for and against that. But just in general, if you want to type in the chat box, so Kristen says no. By the way, Kristen, I just have a random question, just because I noticed your last name is Golden. By any chance, are you related to Jay Golden? He's one of my good friends.
No.
Oh, okay. He's a golf pro here in Orlando, but in fact, his son played in the U.S. Open.
I'm from Texas.
Okay. Okay, just kind of interesting. So Kristen says no, should everyone go to college? What does anybody else think on that topic?
Can I unmute myself and say it, or do I have to go
Sure.
in the chat box?
No, you can, yeah, just you can say it.
Okay, well, I agree with Kristen. I say no.
Okay. Why?
I say no because not everyone can afford it.
Exactly.
Because, college does get expensive, but for the people that can afford it, they are pretty lucky, like including myself. So.
Mhm. Yeah, and Renee says not everyone is meant for college. Good point. Now, so we'll go through some reasons, maybe for and against it. And Marsh says also, yeah, it's definitely not for everyone. There are cons, and sometimes it's just not good for everyone. And once again, the gut reaction from a lot of people might be, in fact, yeah, Kristen, I'm talking about financial aid here in a second, But the initial reaction from a lot of people might be, of course, everyone should go to college. Why? Because if we have a society where everyone goes to college, arguably some of our social issues will be solved. We'll have a more intelligent society. And it's kind of interesting though, because just as we talked about before, should college be free for everyone? Once again, the initial reaction from a lot of people might be, of course, it should be free. In fact, personally, I would gain from it as well, because this past summer, because of the COVID, a lot of your professors here at Seminole got laid off, and I was hoping to save money this summer, and there were some other jobs I was hoping to get, but the problem is that the restaurants and bars were all closed for a large period of time. So next semester, I'm going to have to probably take out more financial aid, even though I don't want to. But it's just one of those things, though. So let's kind of talk about reasons why not everyone should go to college. Things to consider, as Kristen just said, money is a huge issue because a lot of you have to take out financial aid. I have to take out financial aid. In fact, I'm still paying my loans from my previous school, which was going back to the last time I was there in Michigan was 2005, and I'm still paying off the loans. Although that being said, I will tell you one good thing with financial aid, or at least some of the financial aid that you'll get, is that you won't have to necessarily pay it off right away. Like in my case, because I'm actually a student myself now at Murray State with the PhD program, they delay your financial aid as long as you're a student. So if you ever go on and get a master's degree or something like that, at least the financial aid that I get, it gets delayed. You don't have to pay it off right away if you're still a student. The other things to consider is time. Some people just don't have the time. Some people have jobs. Some people can maybe afford the time to go full time. A lot of people can't though. And there are things that come up, of course, family commitments and the idea of, personal accomplishment. It is a good thing to consider that. Like if everybody should go to college or if everybody does go to college, you could argue that that's good because that it gives students a sense of personal accomplishment. So these are all things to consider. Okay, now the authors of that essay from last week argue that the benefits outweigh the costs. But, so on page 321 here, they go into detail about that. They say it's possible to quibble over specific calculations, but it's hard to deny that on average, the benefits of a college degree outweigh the costs. So there is that sense of maybe personal accomplishment and the fact that if you have a degree, you're likely or more likely to get a good job right out of college, right? But on page 323, as Kristen said, financial aid is something to consider because the more financial aid that you take out, that the more that you're going to have to pay back at a later date. So it's important to consider financial aid. The other thing that I want to just talk about here that your authors talk about is on page 324, they talk about private and public universities. Now, not to get too much into detail about this, most state schools are going to be public. So a lot of times it's not terribly expensive, but it depends on where you go. But I can tell you that there are private institutions, and without going into necessarily names of some of these places, a lot of times the cost is 4 or 5 times more than a public education. I mean, so I'll give you an example. I guess I will name names here, and this is not to criticize the university, but I do know that Full Sail University, it costs something like, I think it was like 80 or 85,000 for a bachelor's degree. Now, the good thing is that it's accelerated education, so you don't have to go for 4 years. I think it's like usually 21 months or something like that for most degrees there. But the cost is very, very expensive. Also keep in mind too, that just by the nature of a private versus public school, private schools are more interested in profit. And so, wait, let me just give me 1 second here. I'm just gonna move my chat over here. Okay. And then the other kind of sneaky thing about, and once again, I'm not just picking on Full Sail because there are lots of private universities out there, but the other kind of sneaky thing that some of them will do sometimes is that after you graduate with um, with a bachelor's degree, then they'll try to convince you that, oh, maybe the economy might not be as good, and why don't you just stick around and get a master's degree, which is another 30 or 35,000. So these are all things to consider. That, and then Ryan says he still owes them 27,000. Are you talking about Full Sail, Ryan, or? Wow, okay, okay.
Yeah, it was definitely a mistake going there. It's been like, I think 8 years now, so yeah, it's definitely not worth it. The price they charge.
Yeah,
Was,
yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. I mean, because I used to teach her, and this is not to pick on Full Sail necessarily. I mean, Ryan says it may have been a mistake for him, but I do know that some of the programs though are really helpful for for students that might not be as good with traditional education, and like the show production program, for instance. I know that a lot of the graduates there used to, I mean, still do get jobs with a lot of the theme parks here, like Disney, and they put on shows for Universal and SeaWorld and things like that. So yeah, these are all things to consider. And the other thing to consider with private schools is that there's another one out there too that a friend of mine used to work for, but it was out in the West Coast. I think it was called DigiPen or something like that. And then there's the Art Institute, and one of the kind of sneaky things that a lot of these colleges do is that they have, armies of recruiters that just sit there all day and make calls and to students. The other thing too is that a lot of them target inner city students who might not know exactly what the money that they're going to be paid that they're going to have to pay later on. So these are all things to consider. But like I said, this is not to pick on Full Sail necessarily, because there are a lot of great programs. There are a lot of students do well afterwards, but a lot of them don't. But these are all things to consider about, should everybody go to college. Okay, the other thing that your authors talk about on page 325 is the type of major that you get can make a huge difference in terms of whether you can get a good job right out of college. And what I mean by that is that your authors argue on page 327 that some majors like architecture don't always lead to immediate success right after you graduate. The other thing too, and this is not to pick on these majors, because there are instances where students with architecture degrees end up getting great jobs. And the same is true with history. I mean, if you want to be a history teacher, like I'll give you an example. My dad is a history teacher. Well, he's retired now, but he was a history teacher. And so for a lot of students that are going to be teachers, history teachers, of course, a history major is going to be beneficial for you, not just in terms of the knowledge that you gain, but just it looks good on your resume, right? Because in fact, some of the state laws require you to, I think, to have, well, a teaching certificate, and you have to be certified in certain subjects. So, but one kind of personal example, a friend of mine didn't necessarily want to be a history teacher, or he didn't have the certificates. And unfortunately, and this is a long time ago, so it might be different now. I haven't talked to him in like 12 years or something like that. But I know that right after he graduated with a history degree, it was really hard for him to get a job in that field. Now, later on, it turned out to be okay, because he later on became a lawyer. He went to law school, and history major looks good for that. So, but the type of major that you get can make a huge difference in terms of the success that you'll have. And then the same thing goes with the type of occupation that you'll get right after college. So on page 326, they give examples of that. and they look at different types of degrees and different types of occupations. So architecture, engineering, they talk about, sales, and they talk about arts and the media. And I can tell you too, just from a personal example, if you have a degree in, and I'm not even bashing my former school in Michigan, but because I don't regret it at all. I don't regret getting my master's in a communications field, but ultimately graduates of that program it was hard for them to get jobs. Now it ended up being okay for me after I moved to Florida, but I do know that the program I was in was really suffering because one of the things that accreditation looks at is job placement after you graduate. And my program in communications was difficult. I mean, it was difficult to get students placed immediately after graduation. So I know that they were having a lot of problems. I know that the department head switched multiple times and some people left and so forth. So these things are important to consider as well. And let me just move my chat here. Okay. Now, I'm not sure, and you can tell me in the chat box or just your talk button, has anybody ever heard of an author named Malcolm Gladwell? He's a very popular author. We're actually going to have a whole class. This is something that I do in the English 1101 class, but not till later in the semester, but we're going to have a whole class, and maybe actually it'll bleed over to 2 classes on some of his books. So, I mean, he has written books named The Tipping Point. That was his first one. Then he wrote a book called Blink, which is really, really interesting. Then he wrote a book called Outliers, which is also very interesting. But the one that I want to talk about just right now for a little bit is Ivy League schools. Because actually, it's not even his latest book. I have his latest book. I forget the name of it offhand. I haven't read it yet, but I have it. But the one that he wrote before that is called David and Goliath. And of course, you might know the story from the Old Testament. David was this little kid going up against a giant Goliath. But he uses that metaphor, though, to talk about current things that are happening right now in society. One of the things that he talks about, and we'll go more into detail about this later on this semester when we get to that presentation with him, is that he does a fascinating examination of Ivy League schools versus other schools, and he actually goes through statistics, and the results, what he finds, are absolutely fascinating, because we tend to think, once again, it's just like a common sense gut reaction that a lot of people have, that going to an Ivy League school like Harvard or Yale is going to make you more successful than going to a college like Seminole State or UCF or something like that. I mean, that's just the common sense, what people think. Actually, what he finds is that that's not really the case if you look at the statistics. And the reason for that is psychological, because what happens is that a lot of students who go to those Harvard and Yale Ivy League schools, they come in with excellent SAT or ACT scores, high school grade, point average, and so forth. But the problem is that when a lot of these students get into Harvard and Yale, they're surrounded by all these other accomplished students. And psychologically, it's tough for them to deal with that, because in high school, they were maybe getting excellent grades compared to their peers. And that's not the case with a lot of Ivy League schools. The other thing that he does is he looks at PhD students. And if you're familiar with academics and academic writing and scholarship and scholarly writing, academics are often judged not by how good of a professor they are or what might be. I mean, obviously that's important too, but they're judged by their institutions that they go on to teach for by how much they publish. and how much they publish in academic journals and so forth. And what Gladwell does is he goes through the actual statistics, and he shows that students that go to schools like UCF or Seminole State end up actually publishing more. Once again, it's a psychological thing where Ivy League schools students look at the peers around them, and a lot of them end up leaving their program because psychologically it's tough for them to deal with having peers that are just as accomplished as they are academically. So we'll get into that later. Like I said, we'll have a whole presentation on some of these things too. And your authors talk about on page 329, policy implications. And forgive me because I don't know. Okay, so what they say is that all of this suggests that a mistake to unilaterally tell young Americans is that going to college, any college, is the best decision that they can make. If they choose wisely and attend a school with generous financial aid and high expected earnings, and if they don't just enroll but graduate, they can greatly improve their lifelong perspectives. The point I just want to make about this, though, is that, again, people's gut reaction a lot of times is that, yeah, everybody should go to college and college should be free. But you have to look at different industries in our economy. Some students, in fact, somebody in the chat box mentioned this earlier, that some students, it's just, they're not cut out to be college students. And that's totally fine because there are other industries that they can get into, I should say, and our economy needs those jobs. I mean, people that go into industries like construction or something like that, their job is really important. So we can't just have everybody have college degrees and then go work these lawyer jobs or whatever it might be. I assume, this third bullet point here, I assume that people are familiar with STEM majors. These are majors that tend to have students that end up getting success right after college. So you have science, technology, engineering, and math, because those jobs are maybe more applicable to companies as opposed to a history degree major or something like even my degree, liberal arts. It's hard to get jobs with liberal arts degrees, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means that it might be more difficult. So that's one of the things that your authors bring up as well. Now, let me ask you this though. And these are just random questions. I mean, should there be more scholarships? I mean, what do you guys think? Yeah, Kristen says yes, and I totally agree because this might, and Cordelia says yes, and Kai says yes as well. And I totally agree because this might solve some of the issues where we shouldn't have a policy where everybody should go to college, but for those students who need the financial help, this would give them more opportunities. So more that are openly available, absolutely. Is that if you talk to advisors here at Seminole, and I don't have anyone specific off the top of my head, or if you browse the websites, there are more scholarships out there than people tend to know about. For example, there was a student last semester, really good student, and he was applying for multiple scholarships at the time and asking for letters of recommendation from his professors and so forth. And I haven't talked to him in a while, but I think that he found one. So this is another way that you can I guess, be more financially stable after college if you don't have to pay for it too. Also on page 332, they talk about the influence of parents. And this might be one of the problems with this notion that everybody should go to college, because sometimes parents are so, hell-bent on having their students go to college when they shouldn't really go to college at all, or at least immediately after high school. And they're kind of pushed into this trap with their parents. So parents can have an influence, even though their intentions are good. Sometimes it's not the best intention for their children right after high school. So this is something else to consider. And also this third bullet point about should students go to college immediately after high school? Well, there are plenty of examples out there where students graduate high school and then later on in life, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, now they're prepared to be college students, where maybe before, as high school graduates, they weren't immediately ready to go to college right after high school. So this is something to consider as well. And then your authors give conclusions on page 332. What they basically say is that college can be good for a lot of students, but it's not always the best option. And just question number 5 on page 335, they ask, according to the authors, for certain schools, majors, occupations, and individuals, college may not be a smart investment. Taking the statement as they say, now we're not going to do this assignment in this class, but one of the assignments that they suggest is taking this statement as they say, write a short essay responding to what you think about this subject. Discuss your own reasons for attending college and refer to the author's argument and data and so forth. So, by the way, I talked about the time essay. Just keep in mind, whether you're listening to this live or on the recording, that this topic might be one of the subjects that you can write about for the timed essay. So I know that you're writing about or answering some of the questions in kind of a brief analysis for this week's assignment, or if you did it over the weekend, but the timed essay might ask you to write a longer essay. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the Little Seagull book on pages 90 through 118. So a lot of this might be review from what we talked about last week, because these books, even though they're both good and useful, they overlap a little bit. So the first thing they say is consider the context for your research. So what this means sometimes is, are you writing a paper? I mean, consider the length that you have to write about, consider the amount of sources that you need to cite, consider if you are writing a technical report or a short essay or a longer essay, and so forth. Now, the second bullet point here says, you want to choose a topic and narrow your focus later. So what that means, as an example of this, your first essay that's going to be due next Sunday, you're going to have the option to write about your major and why it's important, or you could take the topic of how is social media affecting our society. But taking the second subject for a second here, what that means is that this is a little bit different than high school writing, because high school writing might ask you to answer that simple question: how is social media affecting society? But that's kind of a broad topic. You could write whole textbooks on that topic alone. So when you're writing an essay in college classes, usually you're going to be taking a topic and narrowing your focus. So if we just ask, how is social media affecting society? Well, be more specific. Maybe focus on a specific company like Facebook or Google, if you want to think of it that way, even though Google's a research engine, not just a social media site. But you could take like maybe Instagram or something like that and just focus on one of those things. The other thing, when you are narrowing your focus, is, in this example, maybe don't just say, well, I think that Facebook is affecting our society in this way. Be more specific. Say, how is Facebook affecting the youth in our society. So you want to maybe start with a broad topic and then narrow your focus. I mentioned last time that if you go on and get a master's degree, your committee is going to have you be very, very specific. So for example, I know that this is not a movie class and I keep bringing up movie examples, but since my emphasis in my master's degree was in film, well, okay, I did my master's thesis on the director, Martin Scorsese. So some of you have probably heard of Martin Scorsese, but my committee told me that for a thesis, you can't just take one director and just write about their work in general. So what they had me do is focus specifically on 4 of his movies. And the other ones maybe came up in writing an argument or arguments, but just having a broad topic like writing about a director like Martin Scorsese, that really wasn't sufficient, or it really wasn't ideal. I mean, if you're going to be writing a book, then maybe you can go through all of his films, right? But the specific 4 movies that I had to focus on were Goodfellas, Raging Bull, Taxi Driver, and Mean Streets, which at the time were considered his best, probably still are, although if you saw The Irishman last year, that was also excellent. But you want to start with a broad topic and then narrow your focus. Start with a tentative thesis and keep in mind that it's going to change a lot as you go through your paper or your thesis, whatever it might be. So Kadila, I did Mean Streets, Raging Bull, Goodfellas, and and Taxi Driver. So those were his 4 most critically acclaimed movies. And also, just in that example too, you're going to have, in this case, you might have whole chapters on specific aspects of my example. I would have a whole chapter on the importance of food in his movies, because that plays a big role. The influence of his Catholic upbringing, and you could write a whole chapter on that. So you might have chapters that are focusing on very specific aspects. So posing a research question, remember the 5 W's from journalism that we talked about: who, what, where, when, why. So pose a research question that maybe goes into this. So it might not just be one sentence, but you might start out with a research question like, how is social media affecting society? And then as you go through more research, you would focus on maybe, how is it affecting the youth? How is Facebook or Instagram? So you want to be very, very specific with that. And then, now this doesn't really apply until later in the semester, but the authors of The Little Seagull on page 92, they talk about finding appropriate sources. So even though it's kind of obvious of the source that you're finding, consider the author of the source that you're finding. Specifically with the author, you have to understand that every author is going to be a little bit biased. So you might find a source on social media that's very, very anti-Instagram, that they think it's horrible. And then another author might have a different bias. So these are all things to consider. Also consider the publication, because publications have biases. So you want to consider what publication that you're getting information from. And also, just as an aside for right now, I'll just say this: when you do your final project later this semester, there might be rules such as finding a certain amount of sources. And let's just say, right off the top of my head, when you're doing an annotated bibliography, you find 5 sources. Now, those sources will have to come from our library, our academic journals that we'll go through later this semester when we get to it. But you can have what we call supplemental sources if they are credible. What I mean by that is that if you find 5 academic sources, you might also find an article from the New York Times or the LA Times or the Wall Street Journal that will connect to your source, to your other sources. So it's totally fine. Like if the instructions say to have 5 or whatever it might be, 3 academic journal sources, you could potentially find a source outside of that that you can connect to as well. Now, the thing is though, with this next bullet point, is the source scholarly? Well, one thing to keep in mind is that even though you are very familiar with doing Google searches and things like that, and Wikipedia, those sources are not considered scholarly. Now, I will tell you though, that Wikipedia is still a good starting point because of course there are links at the very bottom or a bibliography at the very bottom that can connect you to sources that would be more scholarly. But just remember that Wikipedia is not considered a scholarly source, just like if you find a website like Joe Schmo's website, those usually aren't scholarly as well. But to go back to my example, when I was doing my master's thesis on Martin Scorsese, what I did do, in addition to finding academic sources, is that I did also cite reviews of his movies that didn't come from academic or scholarly sources, but maybe I found a review from Roger Ebert in his paper or whoever it might be. So you can have supplemental sources like that. The last bullet point here says to find sources that disagree. And this kind of goes back to citing the counter argument. You don't want to have sources that all say the same thing. Even if it supports your thesis, you always want to have sources that do disagree with each other. Once again, I kind of hate to use a personal example of this, but going back to my thesis, because I don't want to make this presentation just all about my thesis, but I think this is applicable here. My thesis kind of revolved around 2 major theories in the film world. One of them was called the auteur theory, and the other one was called basically just the formalist theory. And there are 2 major authors that disagree totally with each other. One author was named Andrew Sarris, who is now passed away, but he kind of popularized the auteur theory in American cinema in the 1960s, 1970s. And what his argument was that a director's personal upbringing and personal style is how you should evaluate a film. And Pauline Kael, another major theorist, totally disagreed. And she said that a director is not the most important part of a work, it's actually the writer. So these are sources that disagreed with each other, but you can't just have a theory that's just going to be, or an argument that's just going to be citing from one perspective. Now, okay, the Little Seagull also talks about searching electronically. You are all very good, I assume, at doing searches electronically already with using the right keywords and things like that. Once again, Google or Wikipedia would not necessarily be an appropriate source most of the time. It can be a supplemental source, or not Wikipedia, but if you find an article from the New York Times or something like that, it can be that you can search electronically on Google to find those sources. And of course, we're gonna have a session later on this semester about searching our library's databases. I will say that the only bad thing about colleges like Seminole and Valencia is another one, is that, I mean, it's good that we have multiple campuses. I think that Valencia has about 7 or 8. I think that Seminole has 4. Now, the only bad thing is that they all have their own libraries. So when you're doing research, if you're trying to find a book, it might be in a different library, which means that you're just gonna have to drive there to get it. Now, a college like UCF also has multiple campuses, but they have maybe a few more sources than our libraries do. But the good thing about UCF, at least, is that on their library, they have something called the One Search, which you just simply type in keywords and it'll immediately bring up the sources that they have. And of course, the thing to also say about this, though, is that almost all the sources, unless you're citing a book, unless you're trying to find a book, almost all the sources that you're going to be finding in our library are all going to be electronic. So that's good. So you would just literally download the PDF. And we talked about supplemental sources. And here's another thing just to consider is that another sort of supplemental research that you can do would be field research or ethnographic research. Now, what that means, and I'll give you another example, okay? When I was teaching at UCF, the students' final project was to choose a subject that directly affects UCF students or college students in general. So the most popular topic that always came up would be parking. So in addition to finding academic or scholarly sources that might talk about parking in overcrowded places like Orlando, arguably, you can also do field research. And what that meant is that if a student was writing on how UCF could improve its parking, they might do what we call field research or ethnographic research, which is just observation. So if you're trying to make the case that UCF has a bad parking problem, then maybe you would go to a parking garage and just observe for an hour or so. How many people have trouble finding spaces and something like that. Now, as a side note, I can tell you that right now, according to the professor I talked to last night, right now UCF is operating on a 20%, I guess, capacity rate. So you're not going to have any difficulty finding parking at UCF right now. Another thing just to keep in mind, speaking of UCF, is that even though you are Seminole State students, there could be cases where you can search UCF's library and maybe there's a book that you can find and that our library doesn't have, but UCF has. Remember that you can go to a college like UCF, just drive there. Now, you'd probably have to pay for parking, but unless you can find a spot where it's not enforced, the parking's not enforced, but you can go there and it's considered a public library. I don't know if you can check out books, but you can certainly go there, browse books that they have there, make copies, and use those copies. Make sure to keep the citation, but you can maybe use those in your papers that you have here at Seminole State. It's just that you might not be able to check them out. One other point here, speaking of libraries, another thing to remember is that we do have something in our state public universities called interlibrary loan, which means that if you're searching our database and maybe our library doesn't have it, there are ways to, but you find it in another library, even in a different state, there are ways that you can use interlibrary loans, and it doesn't cost you anything. It just might take a week or two to get the book, but you can use what we call interlibrary loans to get books or articles from other institutions. Now, another example of ethnographic research is that I used to know this woman. I haven't talked to her in several years, but for her sort of capstone project that she did for college was to go to a different culture, and let's just say it was a Native American culture. I don't remember right off the bat. And you can observe people in that culture if you're doing field research. So in her case, she did her capstone project on, I forget what country it was, but she actually literally got the funding to go there and live with the people for just a few months to finish her capstone project that she did. The last bullet point here is to make sure to write everything down. I know that seems like obvious, but you would be surprised, and we're all guilty of this, by the way, but you would be surprised how many times when people are doing field research or ethnographic research where they think that they're making, and their intentions are good. It's not like their intentions are bad, but they think that they're going to observe by, and not forget anything, which never seems to happen. So that example I just gave with the UCF parking, don't just go there and observe how bad the parking is at a parking garage there, but record your information so that you have specific numbers and statistics that you can give. The other thing too is that if you're doing field research, another thing that you can do is personal interviews, okay? And whatever your subject might be. So if you are talking about, I don't know, well, I'll give you another example. If you're doing your research, your paper on your college major, maybe you could go and interview one of the professors or one of the students that's in that program. But remember to make sure to write everything down, or if you're interviewing somebody, sometimes it helps to have a recorder. I know that some subjects might not be comfortable with that, but most of them that I've heard about are okay with being recorded for an interview. And as long as you're not going to misrepresent them, so just make sure to write everything down. The other real quick thing I want to say about this as well, because we're all guilty of this, but a lot of the sources that you're going to be finding in our library are going to be in the form of PDFs. So you download a PDF. Remember that Adobe Acrobat, which is what opens PDFs, they do have features on there where you can highlight information, you can save information, you can write notes for that. Make sure to do that, because if you're writing a paper, you don't want to have to go back and then reread an article or forget information that you obtained from that article. So make sure to always write your information down. And once again, we're all guilty of doing this sometimes, where we forget to highlight, particularly with PDFs, but also books for that matter though. Sometimes you read a book and you think you remember all the information afterwards, but it turns out that you didn't highlight enough. And this will also help you add length to your paper, by the way, because it'll give you more things to write about. If you go through a book and you highlight only one or two things, well, you're going to only have those one or two things to write about. But if you highlight multiple things, it's going to give you more information. It's going to be valuable to later to when you're writing your paper, your argument. They talk about synthesizing sources on page 105. This is something we'll also talk about in the future classes, and I'll give you actually specific examples of this. So it essentially means, though, where you're taking multiple sources and connecting them somehow so that your transitions are good, and you're just synthesizing your sources. You're taking multiple sources and making connections between them. Just another thing, a reminder, we talked about this the first day, but avoiding plagiarism is obviously something that you need to do. I mean, I can give you so many examples, including last semester, not just in my classes, but I know that in some other classes, this was a problem as well. This actually happened twice last semester, where students were using papers that they wrote from other classes or other schools and just resubmitting them. And in one case, in some cases you can get an F for that class. And remember that when you submit assignments, even though you might not be able to see it on your end when you're submitting assignments, but your papers automatically go through a site called turnitin.com. And even if you can't see it, your classes, your professors will see it. And it gives you a full report of how much of the paper is plagiarized, and it'll give you the specific sources of where those plagiarism cases came from. I mean, one example from last semester is there was a student that thought he could get away with submitting a paper that he had written before for a different school, because he thought that, well, if I'm submitting it through Seminole State, then they're not going to catch it because it's from a different college that he went to before. But that it doesn't work that way. The Turnitin.com takes papers that are submitted to all colleges, and it'll give you a report. So quoting and paraphrasing, we kind of went over that last week. It's pretty self-explanatory, but quoting is using direct words and obviously put in the phrases in quotation marks and using page numbers or paragraph numbers. And paraphrasing is where you're taking a quote and you're just kind of re-explaining it in your own words. And as I mentioned before, paraphrasing is very valuable because it indicates to your reader that you are understanding the sources that you're reading. And just on page 113, they give different signal words. So for example, this author acknowledges, or this author claims, or this author disagrees, or this author observes, and so forth. So you can go through that list on page 183. And okay, this might actually be research from last class, but just real quickly, let me go through this slide, and then how are we doing on time here? Okay, we have a few more minutes, but let me just go through this real quickly, and then I want to show you a quick video, or just a portion of a video. But when doing research, you should analyze the article and the author itself, not just the topic in general. So this means detecting bias from a publication or from an author. Make sure to put yourself in their shoes. So consider the author's background, the historical period that they're writing from, the culture that they're living in, etc. And of course, pay attention to the author's tone. Now, I apologize, I didn't pull this up before class, but I was going to show you another article from the New York Times where the writer, his name's A.O. Scott, uses tone very effectively. And remember that some sources like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, they're very friendly in their tone, even if their articles might be biased in a certain context. They're usually very friendly in their tones by referring to sources as Mr. or Ms. So tone can be a good thing to watch. Now, just the last thing, well, just a reminder too, that because some student asked last week that the calendar is all in the syllabus for the semester. So you can see the actual reading assignments as well as the actual assignments, the dates, and so forth. One thing I want to do, and this is going to be weird to do, but one of the topics that we might write about, or I'll give you the choice to write about, might be something like this. And hold on, I don't know why. Well, I don't have to show you the, oh, okay, I can show you the video. I'm just going to show you the first couple minutes of this clip, because this is somebody that you probably never heard about, but I might give you the option to write about this week in the timed essay. There is a guy that he works with animals, and we're talking wild animals like tigers, lions, and so forth. He is kind of semi-retired now, or at least from Hollywood, but one of the things that he used to do is work with animals and use them in different movies and so forth. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this topic up, though, that might, if you're interested in this, obviously this will be one of your choices. It's not gonna, you're gonna have more options. So this is kind of a weird video to show, but the reason why I bring this up is that he worked with an animal named Rocky the bear, And unfortunately, Rocky was very well tamed, but he ended up killing somebody. And if you actually go back and you look at Randy Miller's explanation, it wasn't that the bear was inherently mean or anything like that, but the guy that he killed was standing right next to him, and he grabbed his neck, I believe. So the question that I might give you for one of the subjects or topics for the timed essay is, should an animal like this, like Rocky, you're not going to see him here in this video, but should an animal like that be euthanized? Because at the time that this incident happened, and this is going way back to the mid 2000s, and you can see a documentary about it, but the question came up, should Rocky the bear be euthanized? Or because he turned out not to be violent. I mean, Randy had worked with Rocky for, multiple years, and even worked with him after, and there was never a new incident. But should an animal like Rocky the bear be euthanized? So I'm just going to show you a brief introduction to Randy Miller. I know this is kind of a weird subject that you might have, but some of you might be interested in this. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of Randy Miller and his predators in action. And don't worry, the sound is coming on here.
Best work with an animal? Wow, the first. Woo-hoo! That Randy did the tiger jumping on his back with Sven and Stuart Mill just looked at each other and said, gee whiz, we're glad we don't have his job. I mean, this Taurus award is too heavy for actors to carry, so that's why actors can't get them. I tell you what, boys, you show me yours, I'll show you mine. Many of the stunt performances you've seen tonight take months to plan and weeks to capture on film. Show us how he performed the tiger stunts in Gladiator. Please welcome back World Stunt Awards winner for Work with an Animal, Randy Miller. Raise them on a bottle, nurture them like my children. If she gives you that look, you better get worried. Good, stay. Some trainers show their fear when abusing these guys. I mean, there's no reason to abuse them. You raise them with lots of love and affection, and they like people, you know? Look at, come on. You should know. Let her in.
Okay, so I don't want to show you the ad, but so that's one of the questions though that Randy Miller had to ponder, was that after the incident where Rocky the Bear killed that man, who by the way was his cousin, should an animal like that be euthanized? And by the way, this argument also came up, if you remember SeaWorld, where Tilikum, the whale, killed that trainer, and this was also something to consider. Should Tilikum have been euthanized? Now, ultimately, they decided not to, and there's different theories about why that incident happened, but we won't go into those right now. But anyway, so that's just one of the topics that might come up in this week's timed essay. Just write a short essay as to what you think about a topic, and and I'll give you the instructions, but you'll basically have an opportunity where sometime before Sunday, you'll have like an essay, and it'll be timed. So this class is an hour hour and 15 minutes. So you'll have like 75 hours to formulate an essay. Remember to have a good topic sentence, a good thesis, good support for your argument. And remember, the key points of your book is taking a quote that I might give you, or taking just a brief little story about what somebody else thinks, and then writing about what you say. And don't always feel like the article that I'll give you or the quote that I'll give you, you always have to agree with. So anyways, I think that will wrap up right now. Now, this recording, I know that there was an issue last week, but this recording should be on YouTube a little bit later. So before I close this down, and I have to get ready for the next class in a couple minutes, but are there any questions about the assignments this week or any of the subjects that we talked about?
Yes, actually.
Okay.
So just right now we have the one that you pushed back, the first reading. Is there another reading too in between?
Well,
like how many assignments do you have out right now?
Yeah, let me just real quickly go through the schedule. So for this week, there's not going to be another reading assignment, but just if we go through today's date, just go through these, which we talked about the little seagull in those pages, but just kind of review those. And then we're going to talk on Wednesday about the articles from, or the chapters from They Say, I Say, 161 to 211. So,
Okay.
Yeah, for this week though, if you look at the dates, we just have the time quiz for this week, and then the first essay will be due next Sunday.
Okay.
Okay, anything else from anybody? Okay, well, thank everyone for attending. Once again, if you want to re-review the session, it'll be on YouTube later. And just one last thing to mention is that at this point, we don't really have set times that you, like, you're all here at the 8 o'clock session, but if you ever want to come to the 9:30 session, that's fine. And I can see everybody that's on here. So for attendance purposes, you're all fine. But just in the future, and this is just a possibility, so I'm not even saying this, but just for attendance purposes in the future, if you ever have to watch the recording, maybe just let me know through email that, hey, I watched the YouTube recording. And but I'm just saying there's a possibility right now in case, like, I don't know what other classes are doing, but so I'm not sure what your other classes are doing, but I have absolutely no problem if you just want to watch the YouTube video later on in the week or later on that day. I know that people have issues that come up unexpectedly. I know that at least one student, because her classes are online, had to get a job that sometimes conflicts with this scheduled time. So that's totally fine. Okay, well, thanks everybody for attending, and later on, I'll put this on YouTube. And unfortunately with YouTube, sometimes the processing time takes a while, but this should be up like later this afternoon. Okay, so everybody have a great day, and we'll meet again on Wednesday.
Bye. Have a good day.
Okay.